I'm so excited to be here with the three of you. And I'm here with three of Haudenosaunee's finest. Sincerely, I mean that. You were supposed to laugh.
We knew you were serious.
No, it's really wonderful. Actually, joined today with my husband, Neal Powless, and with Onondaga Hawk Clan Chief Spencer Lyons, and Tuscarora Turtle Clan Chief Brennen Ferguson. Now, for being here today, I'm really grateful to have this conversation of what we're calling Matrilineal Men, which the three of you are. You have all grown up in traditional Haudenosaunee matrilineal culture, and I'm just really grateful to be able to have this time and hear from you. So, in our culture, we talk about roles and responsibilities, and I'd like to talk about the role of men, or actually, I'd like you to talk about the role of men in our culture. And so I'm going to create that open space for you.
I think what I think of when we are talking about men's roles, it comes down to oftentimes, it's a fact that men are physically stronger than women, and the question is, what are we going to do with that strength? So that's one thing that I've always been taught, is that we're supposed to be using that strength, which was something that has been given to us by creation, to protect our families and to take care of our families, and that it's not even supposed to be a thought that comes across your mind to use it to abuse your family, mm-hmm. your wife or your children. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's what I think of Haudenosaunee masculinity, is having the awareness that you have this strength, but also the understanding and the compassion of using it right.
What is masculinity, and what would be Haudenosaunee masculinity?
That's a hard question. I guess you can answer it a bunch of different ways. The way I think about it is, again, using our effort and our strength to kind of reinforce or enforce the will of the families. So, when our clan mothers make a decision, or even the women in our family, that masculinity is, again, having the self-control and the humbleness to go with that decision, mm-hmm. and to do what you can to help support whatever that decision is.
As a lacrosse player, it's extremely physical and demanding. It's extremely aggressive a lot of times. And so for the expression of that, it's also learning about how to control and manage that expression of aggression, and learning how to kind of really toe that line. It's a fine edge, right? It's like a nice edge. It's really sharp. And there's a moment when you can take it too far, and you have to understand what managing that space is, and understanding how to utilize the expression, right? Knowing that, especially in Onondaga, you have a lot of the leadership that are chosen by the women, and the women are watching how they play the game, and how they conduct themselves, and how they protect their teammates, how they protect their family, how they give of themselves for the greater good, instead of just focusing on themselves as individuals. And so when you really think about that expression of what does it mean to be that, it's all of those things. It's the fight, it's the offense, it's the defense, it's the defense, and the maneuvering around that space, and sometimes pushing the person you're competing against to respond to that. And so it's understanding that there is a balance between aggression, and understanding that balance between control and how you manage that. And so I think whether it's on the sports field within lacrosse, or within the community, or as a leader like these two gentlemen here, or any other space in the home, you have to find that fine line of balance, understanding that your guiding principle is for all, mm-hmm. and that your job is to protect all, right, for the good of all, right, that we put our minds together as one thing with a similar goal.
I really like both the responses, and for myself, I kind of go back to the cultural teachings and thinking about the original instructions, and I heard an elder describe how men should be, and in the culture we refer to our elder brother, the son, as Ho'ske'egitagona, Like he's the big man, Sidwachi and our elder brother, the son, and that we should be like him, that he's never relenting in his duties and what he provides, and that the elder brother, the son, every single day he does what he needs to do to fulfill his duties. And thinking about like both the responses and like men are supposed to emulate that, and we're supposed to be protectors, providers. But that goes back to kind of what Neal was talking about. Sometimes we're protecting compassion or love, or we need to be able to provide that too. And so there is that balance within what exactly is needed and asked for us, and to find that balance and make sure that we're providing that for the people, for all of our people, because we're such a communal people, and we think about all of our gifts and who we are is supposed to support the greater good of our communities in general and our people in general. So we're always using these instruments, using these stories, using things like lacrosse as an instrument to hone ourselves, and that should be making us greater people, being just a good person in order to provide that back to our communities.
Yeah, it's really wonderful to hear in each of your responses. There's such a element of listening and really like gauging your behavior and looking out to, you know, the natural world, knowing also that there's others who are watching your conduct. So, you know, speaking of roles and responsibilities, which you've talked about a little bit, you know, what are the roles and responsibilities of men, and maybe even highlight some of those of women, and where do we receive those instructions, right?
For me, I think about these things and talking about women and highlighting, they're the main bosses. Like for me, that's like in Onondaga, Ganaktakwaniyoke, we don't start ceremony until we get confirmation from the clan mothers. They give us the nod to say, okay, now. And they say, and I've heard people like my great uncle Oren talk about, well, if you want to know who holds true power in a civilization or society, it's the people that can call for war. And even in that, there's instances through historical documentation to say, well, they would always refer back to the women, whether they would allow the men to go out on what they would call a campaign or to leave the village. And so that's who holds true power. But even that word, gatsatstesa, what we say in the language power, we're always filtering that through the lens of colonization and civilization. What does that mean? Because it means something different in the language, us culturally, than it means like authority or power, that the way that it's used on the outside. And so we're wrestling with these terms. And so for a second language learner like myself, these are things I have to take into consideration in the evolution of who we are as people. Because the other part of it is I always try to look at the humanity. Like what happened to people through the evolution of those times? What were people feeling and going through the coming of the Great Law of Peace, through the coming of things of staving off assimilation and gaihuio. And another strong one is is the responsibilities of the women. It means that she's going about the fire. And people have misused this idea, but in our culture, when they say kajistaya, a fire, they're talking about all of those original instructions. All of those clan families have a fire. All of those people in the councils have a fire. And so when they refer to her responsibility going about the fire, that's like overlooking the entire village, the entire community, and everything about who we are and what we call Haudenosaunee ka. Everything that makes up Haudenosaunee is what she's overseeing when it's referring to the fire. The term fire for the Haudenosaunee is a highly political term, and that even shows up in our history with colonial and imperial entities when they say places like Pennsylvania and the wampum lot, they say we're gifting this land to the Haudenosaunee for them to have a place to put down their fire. And they're referring to this relationship, this government to government relationship and recognition of what fire means. And so all of those teachings, like we, the men, are conductors of ceremony, but it's only because the women have decided that it's become time to do ceremony. We might be the ones speaking and doing the speaking, but it's them overseeing that it's all kept straight and kept true and kept right.
So not to echo anything that Spencer brought up, but I agree with all those good points that he made. But I'm thinking about, this question has been brought up, time and time again, especially in different Confederacy circles and in particular the Great Law of Peace Committee. And people are always coming to the committee and like almost demanding like a list of roles and responsibilities. And what I've seen time and time again is our elders that are on the committee, some of them are still with us, some of them have passed. They repeatedly are hesitant to do that. And what they say instead is, instead of focusing on this prescription of roles, what are roles that we all have? We're at a place in time where there's so much work to be done that there's roles that everybody can fill. And, learning language, learning ceremonies, being involved in your community, being a helping hand to your family, all these things, they always bring those up first, because those are responsibilities that we all have and how we can all contribute.
When I'm inspired by what they both said, in that Spencer talked about when these messages came to us, we had forgotten what our original instructions were. And so what's going on in those times, in those spaces when we forgot? They're singular, they're focused on individual. Animals do the same things. If you look at nature, there's a ecosystem and a symbiosis of how they all work together. Even different animals will work together in that space to make that area flourish. And oftentimes humans come in and ruin that ecosystem and destroy that relationship that all of those different beings have with each other and those agreements that they made with each other. And so for me, understanding those responsibilities and those roles is for us to also maintain a relationship with all of those members within that ecosystem and not to destroy it. And the same thing goes for our family, our community. So it's not just about our roles and responsibilities as humans, among humans, but it's also our role and responsibilities as a member of Mother Earth and within those ecosystems of all of those beings that make that up. Because without those beings doing their thing and doing their responsibilities and their original instructions, we no longer exist.
And just kind of, we're talking about masculinity, so it's not about the way you shake your hips when you do, the smoke dance, right? Like, or maybe it is, I don't know, right?
It is.
A component.
Yeah, right? Yeah, the way you, play lacrosse and, show your, your arms or whatever it might be, right? But how has colonization changed, the understandings of men, masculinity for the Haudenosaunee?
Automatically, my mind kind of goes to back in contact, and we're thinking about material culture and understanding the relationship to the natural world, impacts of those relationships with those colonial entities, the coming of muskets, the coming of brass kettles, and all of those things that at one time Haudenosaunee had been connected so close to the earth and everything in the natural realm. And to see that change, like no longer are we thinking that you have to now shoot an animal with, or take an animal, harvest an animal with a bow and arrow, but then you get a musket. And what does that do to all the traditional teachings? What does that mean that you don't have to have an intimate relationship or understanding to the land or those animals to know that where they are? And there seems to me like there's a trickle effect that happens, that takes place, and it's almost very rapidly if we think about the evolution of people and civilization and how much time that really takes. And then to introduce something like that and just have this rapid change within Haudenosaunee culture, and for that to almost destabilize our understanding. And I would say destabilize, but at the same time, the things that I see is that our teachings have existed and stood against assimilation and colonization, and there's been instances in again looking at the humanity of civilization itself and as people, and for them to be able to hold on to our teachings and to be able to pass that down from generation to generation. And it still means something for us today to call ourselves Haudenosaunee. It still means something to be able to call ourselves Onondaga, somebody from Onondaga, and knowing that now is our turn as a generation to make sure that what's being passed down is going to sustain for the next generations, and to make that meaning and to face today's challenges, whether it's assimilation, colonization, that was faced down. They looked that in the face, and they were able to sustain, and to a point where I can say those words and they mean something to our people. So that's part of that, is we have to make sure that we're meeting today's challenges, understanding that those have to be able to sustain. All of the principles and values of calling ourselves Haudenosaunee and Ongwahua are still passed down. And we have to know, like, that is alive, that part of being human is a living part of culture. Our culture is alive, and it's our responsibility now to make sure that it lasts in the future.
Yeah, you're actually reminding me of a story that I learned from a Pueblo elder, and she was telling me about how that, you know, the women would grind the corn, and that people, just to kind of make the process go a little bit faster, started to put it into a blender. And so more recently, there's been this trend to come back to putting it onto the grinder again. And she said that what became really evident was that there's all these songs, right, and words that go along with coming in that process of grinding the corn, and that when they made that switch to putting it in the blender, then it's like the songs were not being sung, the words were not being spoken, right? And so I'm thinking about like what you're talking about with, you know, just the element of going hunting, right? From learning how to make, you know, your own bow and arrow, and all the teachings that you would receive from the men, from your uncles, your grandpas, your brothers, whomever it might be, right? To teach you all that goes into that, because it's not just making something to kill an animal, but yet there's this whole process and a teaching and an understanding that is imbued right into all of it, right? From the beginning process of making the element to, you know, just full circle to being able to feed and provide for the family or your community, right?
I think it would be easy to point at any part of our society today, and we could analyze how it's been affected by colonization and the patriarchy. But the obvious one to me that I think of, you know, quite a bit, especially when I watch like young teenagers and how they interact with each other. I can remember like in my community and hearing the guys older than me, you know, the way that they would talk about girls, and you know, it was really disrespectful. And we don't realize it at the time because we're young and we're learning. And so you hear it in the locker room, you hear it at school, you hear it, you know, from your family, and you just accept it that that's probably reality. But then there's a huge contrast when we're in Longhouse and we hear the way that, you know, the power of women is described, and in Gardihuyu, when they talk about how the Creator cherishes has a really high regard for women because of their specific duties. And then the speaker, this male speaker, will say this, you know, that the Creator highly values all women, and then all the men will agree. But then in those conversations, again, you know, it's a different story. And so I think a huge thing that we could do today that would make a big impact is taking the time to teach our young men how to, you know, live like we believe that teaching, and to teach them, you know, the way that they're hearing their friends talk about girls isn't appropriate, and that it's just straight up wrong. So that, and educate them on what our own teachings say about women and how they can live their lives as if they do agree that women are as valuable as we're saying they are.
Yeah, yeah. So each of you were raised in traditional Haudenosaunee communities, and what were you taught about how to treat women, and how does that differ from what you see?
My great-grandmother was a clan mother at one time, and all her best friends were clan mothers, and my mother was a home health aide and who took care of elders. So I actually was fortunate enough to find myself in spaces where there were a lot of strong Indigenous women, but a lot of elder teachings too. I grew up down the road from another clan mother, and I was friends with her grandchildren. And so everything in our culture, we say it starts at home. And it's true. Like, I'm the oldest of four. I have two younger sisters. My mom brought us up traditionally in the longhouse and all the teachings that go with that. I was talked to and taught by a lot of elder men and elder women, and it's kind of true. It is true what Brennen had talked about before, and this difference how we go to ceremony and we say, like, this is how it's supposed to be, and these are all the teachings that are how we're supposed to act as a human being, as a man. And then when we leave, that's not what we see. That's not the reality that we're seeing. And I myself, like, I was always taught to never put your hands on a woman, and to always respect them, respect their voices and their choices, and that's sadly because of the things that happen on the reservation life. And I look at just recently a lot of and when I say recently, the last couple of years, and how much data is being shared about the missing, murdered Indigenous women, and all the reality of Indigenous women's existence. This is on territory and off territory. It's very disturbing, because I was taught that, and I always tried to carry myself with that in mind, is how to be and how to talk to women, how to respect them. And then it's true, like, you have those friends, you have those uncles, you have those people that talk a way that isn't appropriate or might not be appropriate, or things that become so normalized on reservation, on territory, that are toxic, they're not healthy. And so that's the responsibility of all of us as Ungahuma people, both men and women, is how do we break that cycle? Where do we break that cycle? Do we have the bravery? Do we have the courage to step up and take action to actually break those cycles? And that's our reality as Ungahuma people, of, I think, where we're at as a society.
Yeah. I was really fortunate to be able to sit in a conversation with 3 other men, Neal being one of them as well, and we were having this discussion about violence that happens, and how even in spaces where, whether it's locker room talk, or our lacrosse is such a big, it's such a part of who we are. And yet sometimes in the locker rooms that the conversations around women, right, can be very degrading. And what does it take to change that? And I know that the culture is shifting, not just for Haudenosaunee, but just kind of generally for mainstream as well, being more mindful of women, being more mindful about violence perpetuated against women, right? And being able to change those narratives. And one of the interesting things that I learned was that it actually is really challenging for men to be able to be, like you said, to have courage, to be brave enough in one of those spaces to say, hey, this is not how we're going to talk about women today, because that there could be some serious consequences physically for the person who speaks up that way.
So I know I don't look it, but I am a slightly different age generation than these two. And in my younger years as an athlete, and I also going to Longhouse, I heard those things about women and how you talk to women, and in my house, how I was supposed to speak to my mom and to my sister, and how those things transpire, and the authority within the household and the community, and also elders, right, teaching me those things. And then I go and play sports, and I have a coach saying different things, or I had other parents in the car on the rides saying different things or talking different ways, or then even hearing things in music and in TV and social, in social spaces. Socially, I was being introduced to media that was completely saying a completely different thing. And so as a kid, I have to be authentic in my Haudenosaunee manliness to say, yeah, that impacted how I interacted with women when I was younger. You know, and I have to, like he said, be brave enough to say, yeah, maybe I was not one of the greatest people at another time in my life, but now I have to do all those things and extra to be a defender of those things, to make those changes, to be the brave one to stand up and say, yeah, it maybe I wasn't perfect, but now, not that I'm trying to hold someone to a higher standard than I would hold myself, but be the example now for myself, for others.
That is a principle that we're taught as Haudenosaunees, making things right. So I'm just curious, you know, how would a man, you know, make things right who might be in a position where he's caused harm to another?
There's the equal trauma that happens. I do a lot of work in this stuff, right, with healing, in my current role, you know, as an ombuds who's working with conflict every day, and so I lean in a lot on the Great Law, and one piece of that, which is about grief. We use the word condolence when we install our leaders, that they go through a condolence. And that's about grief. We actually have 15 stages, so it's a lot more eloquent than the Kubler-Ross grief model that has 6, right? We evolved that understanding of the process of grief and healing through that journey. And it's more than just physical. It's mental, it's emotional, it's spiritual. We talk about clearing your eyes so you can see, your throat so you can speak, your ears so you can hear. But it goes all the way through the body, your energy you leave, and all of the spaces, how you carry on your day, your weeks, your months, your years, how you revisit it back and forth. And so making it right isn't about making it right for me. You're showing up so that you can be the protector of. Tadadaho told us that through the first process with the Great Law. He was terrible. He hurt a lot of people. And then his responsibility as the perpetrator of that was to use that same strength, to use those same abilities that he had to protect all people. And so if men are going to show up in that space, then we have to become the protectors and provide the space as needed when they ask us to show up, they will tell us, ask the question, how would you like me to show up and defend you? And I will show up and defend you in that way. And do your best to do that. That's what's making it right, because you show that you're willing to learn from that and change your behavior to a new course and become the defender of that, if that person wants you to defend them. And you have to respect that that might not be what they want, right? So but you have to be willing and open to hear what that person is experiencing and how they're experiencing it, and go through that journey with them. It's not about they have to do their thing and I do my thing and we just go on. There has to be some way to work on that together. And that takes a lot of bravery to go into that space and be honest and truthful. And so men have to figure out how to heal their traumas, heal their struggles. And it's a life journey. It's a journey that you're on from beginning to end. And so it never finishes. You can only just do the best you can.
I think, you know, when we make things right, it starts with acknowledging that you've done wrong. And I think that's a huge part of any of those processes, whether it's with your parents or a sibling or a partner that you've done wrong to. And, you know, it's acknowledging that you either said something or you did something that you shouldn't have. And I think Neal's absolutely right. It's a two-way healing process, because it feels good to make right with somebody when you've done wrong, and then it feels good to hear somebody acknowledge it when they've done wrong to you. But to me, that's where it starts. It starts with at least acknowledging that wrong was done, and then the two of you can work out how you're going to move forward.
Yeah. Thank you, all three of you. It's not, you know, it may not be easy to address, but I really appreciate that, you know, you've been very open in this way and talked about healing, right? I mean, when we hear about masculinity and toxic masculinity that's happening out in the bigger society that surrounds us, you don't really hear too much about healing. And I appreciate that you've addressed that, right? It is a healing process. It becomes one for you as a man. It becomes healing, you know, for another person if you've harmed them, right? And so I really appreciate that. Thank you.
I think the perception is the perception is that if you engage in that process as a man, you're weak. And I think the thing that about going into a space into that to heal something, a trauma or a struggle, usually it's probably one of the hardest things you're ever going to do, is to own up that you hurt somebody and to be honest and authentic with that. And so it's actually probably one of the more stronger things that you're going to ever do, and probably one of the hardest things that you're ever going to do, is to show up in that space. So I think it's seen as being weak and vulnerable when I actually think it's really about strength.
Yeah. Oh, and speaking of strength, right? All three of you are fathers, and you have welcomed children into this world. And so I actually just want to ask you, what is that? As a man, as a Haudenosaunee man, what is that to welcome? Like, what is the teaching that you understand about children coming into this world? And, what is the role you have? How do you welcome children into your life?
I think the most direct way is we have a practice of fathers literally welcoming new babies into the world. We speak to them as if they're any other person, and make them aware that they're here on earth now. And I know when I've spoken to my children when they're born, I make sure that first I introduce them to their mother, who had just went through this huge amount of stress and hard work to bring them here. And I tell them, hopefully you'll be of good help to her and your whole family into the future. And from there, I'll introduce this new baby to the different parts of the world, and give them a little tiny bit of information about what that relationship is. And I make sure that they hear from me that, I'm their father and I'm going to be here, and I go over who their family is and their clan and their nation, so that when they first arrive here on earth, they hear those things and they won't be confused about it for the rest of their life.
It almost mirrors the Thanksgiving address. You start with your family and their family and say, I am your father, this is your mother, these are your grandparents, clan family, and then you go work your way right through the Ganehanuga Thanksgiving address, like the earth and the relationship that there'll come a time they'll notice there might need medicines, and it's an introduction for that natural world also to this new spirit that's bringing here. And this happens even before the naming process that happens in ceremony and longhouse, but this is part of it. Like, the clan mother should have that name, and that name should be ready for that child even at that moment, and so that they have that, and we're setting their path, we're setting their mindset, and then from there we're supposed to always be that example for our kids, right? And we try our best to live our lives like that. I know for myself, like, it completely changed my view of the entire world. Like, things that I never thought I would care about, or things that I never realized I did care about, all of a sudden were the most important things in the world to me. I remember driving home with my first, and me and her mom are in the car, and I was so upset with the road because the road was bumpy, and I was so worried about her health. Like, do I have the right car seat? And is she getting bounced around too much? I'm like, this darn road. And it's like, things that I thought were important to me as an individual, they really fell by the wayside. And I start understanding how minuscule, or maybe even like words like how petty some things were in my life, and how I might have been giving my attention to the wrong things. And to now be a part of this child's life, and for this child to have made me a father, it completely changed the world for me in my perspective of the world. It completely changed the ideas that I had of who I was, or even what I aspired or wanted to be, or even things that I didn't even know I would become.
I'll say, even growing up in a traditional family, in a traditional household, we didn't talk about that kind of ceremony for the kids. So when my kids were born, I didn't do it, right? And for me, it's like, I wish I did, right? I wish I knew that at that time. So, I'm sure there's Indigenous people watching this like, oh man, I didn't know that, or why didn't I do that, right? And it's okay because I was still able to infuse thought process, Indigenous Haudenosaunee thought processes to my kids as young kids as they grew up. I understood my relationship foundationally with them because I understood the ceremony, the connections, the conversations with those things. So while I didn't have that conversation on the first day, I did have those conversations throughout the duration of their young childhood. And so I can look back on it and say, yeah, I didn't do that, but I did okay, you know, and I can still talk to them today and talk to them about it and share the knowledge, right? What you do with the knowledge is what you decide to do with the knowledge once you have it, right? But if you don't have that knowledge in that moment, that's also okay too. We're survivors of genocide, all four of us sitting here. We're the ancestors of survivors of genocide. And sometimes we forget things. Sometimes different families didn't pass all those things down. And sometimes it didn't get to you. And that's okay. We have to be able to forgive ourselves for those moments and not hold on to that energy and say, oh my gosh. But once you know it, then you have a responsibility to give it on to this next generation so then they can pass it on from that point on. So I know that eventually my kids, when they have children, will understand what that means and what their role within that process and that journey can be after that. So, yeah, I didn't do it. I didn't get to do it. But certainly it also changed my life monumentally. I certainly made different decisions in my lifetime based on that experience. And it guided my choices, even though it was in the middle of a professional sports career. It provided its own journeys and struggles, and at the same time informed me as a human being who I want to be. And so so it's very powerful to kind of understand that you have that opportunity when this spirit comes through that channel and arrives 9 months later in your hands. What do you do with it? You know, what is your responsibility now at this point moving forward that will impact you for the rest of your life?
Yeah. Feminism can be seen in direct opposition to patriarchy and masculinity. But from your perspective, how is rematriation different?
From what I see, and you know, in my own community, and then also knowing you and the work that you guys do, when I think of like Western feminism, oftentimes it's, you know, they frame it as being equal to men, or they frame it as, you know, women can do the same work that men can do, or things along those lines. And from what I know in my community and what I've witnessed as during my time as a leader, I meet with my clan mother pretty regularly, about once a week, and she'll bring a few helpers with her, and we'll just go over nation topics, family topics, clan topics, and just have a discussion about it. And sometimes I bring my own helpers as well. And what I've noticed is that, you know, it's true that men and women think differently, and not to say that men think better than women or women think better than men. You know, it's just we simply view the world differently. We have different experiences, and that, you know, contributes to our own thinking. And bringing those two different types of thinking together to both contribute equally to the end result or the decision making, I feel like that's how I view kind of the work of your company here, is reasserting that process of bringing the thinking of men and women together equally.
Rematriation and rematriated spaces are about returning to the source of creation, the source of Mother, and they're associated with and related to the moon and the water, and those are the things that inform women's process. And Spencer talked earlier about the sun and how informed by the sun and fire, right? He talked about fire and the value of fire and the importance of fire, and that we both have to cultivate it. And we can certainly think about times where if you have too much fire, you evaporate all the water and water ceases to exist in that space, and that's not a healthy space. And if you have too much water, you extinguish that fire, and that is also not a healthy space. And so understanding that rematriation is about finding and acknowledging that balance between fire and water, between women and men, and between all of the ecosystems around us, and that balance is about understanding how they work together, how heat and water, they work together, and how they have to coexist to have a healthy ecosystem, and they have to find that balance. And so for me, rematriation and rematriated spaces absolutely have a space for men. And they require that men show up in those spaces and participate in that process to evolve that ecosystem so it's a healthy space. If it's just women or just women's power, then there's not equality, then it's not going to be a healthy space. They have to have those equal forces working together in unison.
For me, being a second language learner and a student of culture, a student of history and understanding, and when I heard rematriation even using as a term, I think about revitalization, language revitalization, cultural revitalization, and how that balance needed to be reclaimed and being brought up the way that I was brought up to see how sometimes things were swayed in one direction or the other. And I really supported that idea, and I do support that idea of rematriation, because for me, that isn't necessarily just a strictly feminine term. For me, it's a cultural term because of the way that I was brought up, the way that I understand who I am as a Haudenosaunee person, and how we understand the matrilineal society. And so it isn't strictly feminine, it isn't strictly masculine, but this balance and a reclamation of these voices and a reclamation of understanding our responsibilities as people. And that's what I see is happening in the work from Rematriation and the group as an organization, is to step back into these spaces and reclaim certain spaces, but at the same time never neglect, because at the end of the day, Haudenosaunee is Haudenosaunee. And at the end of the day, being Haudenosaunee is being Ungwahuma, being a real person. And everything in our culture is just really simple and practical about being respectful and being a good person. It's like really simple and really practical. And how we move and how we need to be able to move as Haudenosaunee people in today in balance with outside culture. Like, yeah, we do need to reclaim those spaces for ourselves as Haudenosaunee people. And I don't think that is exclusive coming from, I see that being understood from an organization like Rematriation, and I respect and I appreciate that as revitalizing and being a part of that effort into re-strengthen and making sure those teachings are strong for future generations.
Where do two-spirit and non-gender conforming people fit within the worldview of the Haudenosaunee?
I think as we've talked, this afternoon, we can acknowledge that there's so much work to be done with language work, ceremony work, this whole process of learning and also unlearning some things and going back to, where we're supposed to be as Haudenosaunee. And that work is real. We have hired people to learn language. We have hired people to revitalize any number of practices in the arts, in the agriculture, all these things. And there's so much work to go around. I think that there's enough work for everybody. So people that want to contribute to that work and what it means to be Haudenosaunee, the orientation, 90% of the time or even more, it's not even, the question doesn't make any sense because there's so much work to do that anybody can help. I'll acknowledge that in certain ceremonial instances, we know that there's women's ceremonies and we know that there's men's ceremonies, and that's kind of a different question. And maybe we need to address that separately. But 90% of the time, the question, can be answered simply that, anybody can contribute to the work that needs to be done.
I think these conversations have been happening more and more in our communities because it's people are finding the space to become themselves and finding the courage, like we talked about, having the courage to step into spaces as themselves. Being somebody who is taught from a very traditional aspect, I look at the language and like I had mentioned before, there's feminine roots even to the verbs and masculine roots. When I think about two-spirit and this term was only coined in the 70s and 80s, I do believe, as some convention in the Midwest by Anishinaabe or Ojibwe person, and they brought this idea and this term Two-Spirit. And I think about myself as, I also think about who we are fundamentally as Haudenosaunee people. And we didn't call ourselves Haudenosaunee until the founding of the Confederacy and becoming people of the Longhouse under the Great Law of Peace. Part of the principles of the Great Law of Peace are equity, inclusion, and understanding that we also need diversity. And it's so funny in stepping into my own work in some of the spaces that I work among, like academia and other colonial institutions. These three words have become buzzwords in the last like 10 years or so. And it's like, wow, all right, you guys are finally catching up to the Great Law of Peace.
Yeah.
Like, this is who we are fundamentally as Haudenosaunee people. But when we look at, when I look at traditional teachings and when it's passed down and taught to us, I always wonder to myself, and it comes down to this conversation of nature and nurture. I have respect for all forms of life and everybody, and like my perspective is the same what Neal shared earlier, is the bug's life and the ant's life is equal to my life, and my life is equal to the tree's life, is equal to the deer's life, and everything that who we believe we are as Haudenosaunee is in equity with the entire natural world. Mm-hmm. And so these conversations do need to be had, like Brennen was saying, is like, well, how does that look? Because if we're truly Haudenosaunee people living in equity and inclusion, then if that was the work that they enjoyed and that's how they identified themselves, then that was the role that they just did. Where we find ourselves today is in need of having conversation, and how do we find the way to peace? Mm-hmm. Because the people that identify how they want to identify, and whatever terms that is, and how they want to live their life, is, if they're not in peace, then it's not fair. Mm-hmm. It's not just. It's not how we are as Ungahua people, as Haudenosaunee people, and we need to recognize that everybody has that right and responsibility to create peace among our communities.
Yeah.
If that means having a conversation in order to make that fit, I feel like it's just more so simple as just as much as it's complicated, maybe because of how mainstream culture has influenced a different generation, an elder generation that currently is the leadership in Haudenosaunee country.
Yeah.
When someone has a gift, you find space for it. Because if you're in a community and it's an ecosystem, you find a way for that gift to support the community. And so I think that's really what the conversations need to be if we're going to get into that space and talk about what those things are. And what that means is, how do those gifts then support the community and help lift us all up? And I think it goes beyond just sexual orientation. There are many different things that our communities are doing within themselves where we could certainly sit down and have conversations about how can we be living into the space of inclusion that we say that we are. And then let's think about how we're including a lot of different things within our culture that we've tended to push away as other, and how do we turn that process and look back inward and say, yes, let's include you in this conversation. Let's find a seat and a space for you and a role for you to share your gifts and participate within this ecosystem so that we are stronger together, as opposed to pushing you out and being less than because we can't find a space for you.
Mm-hmm. I, like to bring our conversation, full circle, and to ask you, what is the most important lesson that you believe people can learn from the Haudenosaunee about living in a matrilineal culture?
I think that for me, it's understanding that anyone, including men, does not need to be afraid of women's inherent power and authority of creation. We all came into this space through Mother. All life is birth and comes through Mother. And so if we are going to acknowledge that inherent power and gift, then we acknowledge where we come from, our source, our creation space. And in order to be in our best self, we have to understand that authentic, inherent authority. And I've heard it many different ways from elders that have passed on, men and women, and I still hear it today with different ones and different ways of saying it. But it all kind of says the same thing, that when you acknowledge creation and you acknowledge source, it provides for you. The same way Mother provides for you, the same way creation provides for you. And so sometimes, some people don't have that space, but they find the support of a community that helps us. So there's many different definitions of what that can become, but it's the ecosystem that supports it.
I think, well, just thinking about my own experience at Tuscarora and the way my clan mother and I have worked things out of how we progress work. And oftentimes we bring it back to our clan. And it's a really good feeling, especially when the young mothers bring their kids to our clan meetings, because then they're seeing this and they get to experience it. And not only that, but at the end of our clan meetings, or the last thing we do before closing, is we go around and we give everyone a chance, if they have anything else to say or any last comment or anything they want to bring up for future discussions, everybody has a chance to talk. And that includes the kids. And it's pretty rare for the kids to talk. Usually they just hide behind their mom, or they'll just say pass or something like that, but at least they know that they have the option to speak. And so I think that's something that American society could really benefit from, is if they embrace the voice of everybody. We see it a lot, trying to limit people's voice, or trying to limit the way they do it in American society with voting, limit their access to voting. And they think that that's going to make them powerful, but in reality, if more people were included in the discussion and were able to voice their opinion, then it would make them a stronger society. And I think that would be a huge takeaway. I can speak for myself, and I'm sure for these two, that we just did the best that we could today to kind of provide some insight. But also another key takeaway is, I want people, like we had said through the discussion, to take the time to address those young boys and those teenage boys and try to give them the information to put them on a good path. We see so many young people get lost at that time in their lives. And that's more than just their relationship to women, but the relationship to themselves and the relationship to their family. And if you're one of these people, or anybody, always remember to have compassion for yourself too. I know that, when I was young, I made mistakes in my relationships, and I said things or that I had to apologize for. And that's part of that process of learning and unlearning, to be a better person and to be a better Haudenosaunee person for sure.
Rematriated Voices was recorded on Mohawk land at Minnowbrook Conference Center, overlooking Blue Mountain Lake in the Adirondack Mountains. It's a collaboration between Rematriation and Access Audio from the Special Collections Research Center at Syracuse University Libraries. It was produced by me, Michelle Shenandoah, and Jim O'Connor. Audio recording and mixing by Brett Berry at Silver Hollow Audio on Lenape land in the Catskills. Edited by Andy Robinson at PR Productions. Production coordinator, Meg Craig of Orange Television Network. Executive production assistant, Catherine Farrow. Production assistants, Jalen Jimerson, Pamela Pembleton, and Corinne Miller. Sound assistants, Griffin O'Neill and Olivia Peters. Cultural and storytelling consultants, Rachel Porter, Gudgy Junie Fox, and Neal Powless. Research assistant, Nada Mergani. Energy healer, Christina Porter. Theme song, Healing Song by Bear Fox and Teoswate. Yawe Go. A big thank you to Chancellor Kent Severud, Candace Campbell-Jackson, and Patricia Delante from the Office of the Chancellor at Syracuse University. Similar thanks to Nicolette Dobrovolsky and Courtney Hicks of the Special Collections Research Center, and Aileen Gallagher and John Glass of the SI Newhouse School of Public Communications, and a special thanks to Linda Paris of the Open Societies Foundations. Vocal coaching by Joanne Yarrow of Distinctive Voices.